Hello everyone, today we talk about pre-Islamic Arabia. Um, so we've been discussing sometimes already about it in other videos concerning especially the origins of the Islamic invasions and looking a bit at the background of Arabia, of pre-Islamic Arabia, although we never ever talked in detail about this. And today also we will stick to a rather generalist overview on this this environment. So we're going to essentially discuss the society, international relations, the main political entities existing in this period, roughly in the 6th century, but also looking at before, since the history of Arabia is actually pretty old, and it would also deserve a bit more of a deepening. So today, once again, I'd say it's not going to be extremely specific, but I promise in the future we will give even a more thorough look at this history. Especially, I'm very passionate about the Sabaeans. Passion as an amateur, actually. I'm no expert about them, but I think it's a very the history of the so-called Arabia Felix, like the Romans called it, is definitely very fascinating. It's also something very old. Think about the Marib Dam and the the Queen of Saba. Let's say all these. It's very fascinating. But so today maybe we will give a look at it just very briefly. However, so when the figure of Muhammad emerged on the scene of the Arab world, the Arabic Peninsula was substantially inhabited by nomadic tribes of the so-called Bedouins. The word Bedouin comes from the I think Arab Badawi, also known as Bedouin. I think it's a bit more of an Arabic variation, not really sure, which means roughly, the inhabitants of the Badw. I'm not sure whether I'm pronouncing this correctly. That is the I don't know really what the etymology is. It would be the desert, but I think not in the way we characterize it, especially in the Arab, but rather like the inhabitants of the wilderness or the steppe. I'm not sure about this, but this should be the etymology. And this is still the term that designates, those nomads of the desertic and semi-desertic areas of Arabia in opposition to, the sedentary communities. So those who are instead inhabiting the cultivated areas and also the urban centers and so on. So the term Bedouin actually has no really an ethnical meaning whatsoever, because as you have understood, that designates a just a kind of a lifestyle. And in fact, this term was exported eventually into North Africa. That we talk about the Bedouins both for North Africa and Arabia, so that's indifferent because of the simply of the environment and the communities that are pretty they're pretty similar in these two regions. So these Bedouins were organized socially on the base of clans, patrilinear clans, especially that are connected all to the forefather of the tribe, so-called Kabila. And so, traditionally, these populations lived livestock, and they famously in these tents that are still part even of the, today's Arabia. Even the most advanced countries still retain, sometimes in the elites, this idea of going to live in some tents to kind of follow the steps of their forefathers, and this is kind of interesting. And naturally, these weren't actually the only inhabitants of Arabia at the time, because as we've seen, there were also other sedentary tribes. So this was normally the tribe, the average, was not just about Arabia. Actually, the whole world, unless it wasn't organized in a more structured statal form, was actually based on clans. However, these other sedentary populations, now naturally Arabia is very big, it's very large, so there is actually also a variety of climates, of environments. It's not also simply and stereotypically characterizable, but let's say there are areas, especially in the south, there are definitely more were sedentarized and actually knew sedentarization since a very early age. So these were instead inhabited by peasants and craftsmen, and were characterized by a say, looking at the Arabian Peninsula as a whole, we see this essentially pretty scattered settlement net, a very rather weak net of settlements, and also pretty fragmentary, that were that included rarely certain cities proper, even walled centers. I mean, especially, I repeat, certain centers in the south were particularly developed in this sense, and way more numerous were, in fact, instead the oases. So the oasis dotted basically this enormous desertic plains, and this naturally existing because of the emergence of the underground waters on the surface. So this brought to essentially a actually at the time of the 6th century of a growing agricultural practice in these areas that was, however, rather limited by the exiguous surfaces that could effectively benefit from systems of irrigation. This is very important because there is a sort of development in civilization. Sometimes, for the sake of simplicity, we just like now we draw this picture as if human settlements and given a certain territory always remain the same. Telling the truth, no. The process of sedentarization was slowly taking root, especially in some areas where partially had not existed before. There were also other dynamics now that were very important, including trade, that had been a bit always the greater fortune of Arabia, located between the Mediterranean, the Indian Ocean, so not facing directly the Mediterranean, but however being in the middle of the two seas. So also being located at the outskirts of otherwise extremely fertile areas, just like Egypt and Mesopotamia, and being therefore this very important crossroad between north and south, east and west. And irrigation was always a great concern for these Arab populations, given the scarcity of water, and therefore stimulating the local technology, let's say, to cope with this problem. And this is very important because when the Arabs eventually conquered vast areas of the world, so stretching from the Atlantic Ocean to the Indus Valley, they sometimes, and especially if you look at areas like in Europe, for example, like Spain or Sicily, they introduced certain irrigation systems that were otherwise quite advanced, because at the beginning, now these irrigation systems were in Arabia proper were naturally something relatively modest but effective for that special environment. Then the Arabs kept this kind of instinctive interest for irrigation when they began to read about hydraulics when they seized the major Byzantine, especially libraries, etc. So learning from the technology of the Hellenistic times, etc. They kept developing this, and sometimes the Arab domination transformed really the landscape with these irrigation systems, these fountains, etc. The idea of the fountain is very important. It's something you find also by Persian influence. You know, the Persian gardens were characterized also in Abbasid times during the Caliphate by this extreme intense taste for water. This idea of the garden was a sort of vision of the paradise, and this Islamic paradise was dotted with, in fact, with springs, with fountains. It was a matter of really, I think, partially looking also at the past of the Arabian traditional world, but also in having, let's say, absorbing influences from other populations, and also because if you think about it, the Arab dominations of course, they extended into extremely diverse territories, but as a whole, between the Maghreb and Mashrek, they you know, the semi-desertic areas were kind of still out there. Of course, they arrived up to the glaciers of Afghanistan and other extremely cold regions with a lot of snow and rain, etc. But this kind of general interest for irrigation systems kind of remained, and was also relatively different in technology compared to, I don't know, the thing that existed in other areas of Europe, especially. In fact, also in ancient times, the irrigation systems, I don't know, the Romans used aqueducts in a certain form, it's a certain technique. In places like Egypt, like Mesopotamia, there were other systems that worked, especially as an underground collection of water. Maybe we will talk about this one day, because technology under this point of view is always very fascinating. But however, these are also relatively similar problems depending on what ultimately the environment dictates as. So, talking about agriculture in Arabia, this was mostly widespread in the, as we said before, in the southern part of the Arabian Peninsula. And this occurred chiefly for one reason. That is not that there are extremely, this is not a particularly, humid or area. Let's say it's not that there are extremely. It's actually a humid area, as we will see now, but there are not enormous basins of water you can, etc. But thanks to the monsoons, so to the monsonic rains, it was possible eventually to over time to collect large amounts of water, especially along the coasts of the Yemen and the Hadramaut. So this was connected also with other factors, such as the fact that, for instance, these two regions were the traditional, say, meeting point between the trades of the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean area. And particularly famous back in the day had been the Marib Dam. The Marib Dam was this actually amazing feat of the one of the engineering wonders of the ancient world, and basically it's around the Marib Dam that the Sabaean and Himyarite kingdoms actually developed, and also the Marib these two powers fought over the control of the Marib Dam. Eventually, the Himyarites being able to seize it from the Sabaeans, and this really this system really functioned through the monsonic rains. And this is, the old dam, because there is a dam today as well, but by the way, it's been bombed by the Saudi in 1215 in part. But say the old dam is something that extremely old, because the first engineering the first canal networks and earth dams seemingly date back to even 2000 BC. So very long time, and the greater dam that eventually became so important also for the local, for in order to enable to trigger the rise of certain civilizations locally, was built back to about the 8th century. It's not that we know a big deal, a big much about this, because we don't really know precisely how, when certain things happened. Arabia kind of in the 8th century is lost in a kind of a mythical past, like other areas of, by the way, of the same West. But this is very important, because this now I don't want to get in extreme detail to in the construction and all the problems, but let's say that it was, as far as I understood, but I have to check this in more detail. This dam basically had many problems at a certain point breaking down, but especially I think it was progressively expanded, or at least there was a sort of containment that was increased without any further structural modification of this system. This brought a lot of problems also for siltation of the waters, that is essentially the pollution of water because of materials that come from the earth, and this dam began to essentially collapse in this late antique period between the 5th and the 6th century, and the last repairs date in fact to the mid of the 6th century, and after that eventually the dam collapsed. And this was actually a great problem, and I think the collapse happened like sometimes in the 70s of the 6th century. And the Marib Dam actually allowed, as we were saying, the irrigation of the surrounding territories, and therefore allowing a pretty intense agricultural activity all around. And actually the Marib Dam was, in fact, in Marib, it was the same capital of the Sabaean kingdom. The Sabaeans had been this actually a population, a Semitic population of southwestern Arabia that was already known from the first millennium BC. There are many ways to name it. Today we actually call them the Sabaeans, in fact, from the Saba, that's either from the classical authors or even from the Ethiopian, because the Ethiopians had eventually an influence over these areas as well. And so we would be practically in today's central eastern Yemen. So these were populations that are recorded since very early times, from the times of the Assyrians, also in the Bible, and there is the famous episode of the Queen of Saba that went with a caravan from her land to Jerusalem to meet the famed Solomon, and so even putting the Jewish king to some test with it, some enigmas and etc. And allegedly extremely remaining extasiated by his figure and praising him. And and by the way, the Sabaeans didn't have queens, so it's merely a myth actually, but it's still interesting because it proves the relations, the pretty intense relations that existed since such an early age between these, say, powers that were actually pretty far geographically from each other, but being connected through these caravan routes and having also evidently many interests in common, economically speaking, especially. the so I think the major phase of expansion occurred in the second half of the first millennium BC. The king Marib al-Battar extended for some time the Sabaean dominion on a great part of the Yemen, and between the 3rd and the 1st century BC, the Sabaeans expanded their control over the actually between the 2nd and the 1st century BC on the Minans and the kingdom the kingdom of Minay and one of Katapan. So eventually the Sabaeans enter into contrast with the Himyarids, that were these this state substantially that had formed in the south of the highlands of the Saba, and whose capital was Zafar, and the and towards the 3rd century AD, basically the Emir overran the Sabaeans and managed to unify the whole southern Arabia. Then eventually, towards in the last centuries, the Abyssinians of Aksum began to expand into the area, and they from the 70s of the 6th century, the area saw also a Sassanid domination, quite importantly, because the Sassanids wanted basically to at that point they were kind of reaching the apex of their power, and they craved to basically close all the Roman connections, the trade routes with the East, trade routes, say better, with the East, and definitely Arabia was. We'll see later. The Romans had extended some. They had created some client kingdoms into, especially among the northern Arabians, and this equated to basically control the Red Sea trade. So the Sassanids were also naturally it was a kind of a decentralized government, of course, but nevertheless, it's important that such a huge power like the Sassanid one so fit to expand into that direction, and also into the Horn of Africa as well, so to really choke the sea traffics in the Red Sea between Africa and Arabia. So the main activity of the Sabaeans, in terms economically speaking, was naturally the production and exportation of let's say various. Of course, they mostly also lived of simply shifting goods from north to south, etc. But frankincense was the main say production of, and so aromas, scents, etc. that were also conceived for as luxury goods for these, the tastes of the of big empires like the Roman one, of the tastes of the elites, chiefly. So these were luxury products, and these were polytheists essentially. Also in here, there was a lot of animism involved, but let's say where a more sedentary civilization starts, there is this evolution from animism that is never really over at a certain point, and the creation of more, let's say, defined deities. However, there was a sort of a supreme god. There was Attar, that was in fact not surprisingly connected in the south of Arabia, in this southern Arabian context, to the monsoonic rains. So evidently these monsoonic rains had this. This explains how important these rains were, the monsoons were for the Saban in the Saban world. Then there was this was a kind of a celestial god, a primary, supreme god that basically represents a metaphor for saying that the world Saban civilization revolved around the Marib Dam, and that the destiny of the world kingdom relied essentially on this. So that's why it was so important. Then it was instead a sort of a kind of say national god, so more proper of the local traditions, but however with certain consistent external influences. That was called Al-Maka or Ilmuka. So this had kind of solar and Dionysiac characters, and a plethora of tribal deities. So that these emerged really mostly from the animistic background, and being attached each one to a specific clan, because it was a kingdom, also relatively centralized. There were class of commoners and people living into these cities, and we've seen craftsmen, peasants. So it was also a consistent military organization, to be honest. It's also very interesting. Maybe one time we will see it more in detail. And the seemingly the Saban religion, there was a lack of female deities, although there were certain female figures like spirits of some sort, that they function a bit like a guardian angel of the single individual. And this name had seemingly the root word was sun, which in South Arabic has a female gender, so linguistically. Another very prominent figure that was a kind of a is prominent also in the local iconography, especially in the late antique, and that symbolized Attar, was the Steinbock. That was a bit the symbol of the Sabans in some way. And there were also written records in the area. Now this is very interesting as well, as this all large century civilizations, the Sabans began to write written accounts since an early age. By the way, always consider that Arabia is not really isolated from the surrounding areas, that they always had a great and intense relation with the Mesopotamians, with the Syrians, because actually now we divide the Arabians as if they were, but these were all Semitic populations. I mean, there is not a big deal of a difference from the whole Mesopotamia, including, I mean, if you take even the Near East, Syria, Palestine, those are Semitic populations just like the Arabs. So actually there are not huge differences. They grew mostly because of the division of the posed by the desert, but actually from an ethno-linguistical point of view, we are actually pretty we're looking at essentially similar populations, especially this time that weren't but really having a very intense exchange. So what I was thinking, what can we talk about now? So here we've seen in the south. We can also talk about the Himarites, given that we discussed them. So the Himarites instead were, as we've seen in the classical sources, they were called the Homeritai, so in Greek, and they, as we've seen, they rose to prominence in the beginning of the Christian era, actually, and they managed to even kind of mix with the Sabans rather than overwhelming them, because as you understand, these were kind of similar populations as well. So As most of the times, the main goal is seizing certain centers of powers. Take the Marib Dam, in fact, that was extremely this extreme. I mean, it was essentially the center around which the whole Southern Arabia civilization revolved. So it was enough to control that, and then was not much of a, by certain groups, and not much of a further ethnic contrast, probably. And the Himyarites were practically eventually destroyed by the Abyssinian invasion of 525, or at least as a larger power. Although the clanic, the essentially clanic, I don't know how to say this, humus, if you want, of these societies kind of remained with different lineages that controlled over certain areas. So this is more or less how it was. Excuse me, I close here certain things. Cool. So, in the center and north of Arabia, instead, as it's pretty much known, the desert has really the dominant role. And in here, the communities were instead, or largely, almost exclusively nomadic, or semi-nomadic, depending. There is a bit of a terminological problem of defining certain things, but today we mostly the word nomads. It's an accurate definition. And these were essentially shepherds. They breeded camels, sheep, goats, etc. And they so this was their normal activity. However, as all the nomadic populations, there was a lot of small scale, let's say, well, it's a bad definition, but let's say it was a lot of warfare, tribal warfare between these clans that obviously always wanted to steal each other's livestock, and that was practically the whole thing. It wasn't just about that. There was also a big deal of raiding of the caravans that passed with this extremely wealthy products, sometimes, as we've seen, from the axis north-south. So since these nomads were also mostly raiders, they were pretty much used to and skilled into the craft of arms. So it was a arguably highly militarized society. So you have to imagine this deserts essentially being continuously moving around all the various oases. So this was a kind of a incessant, constant, continual moving, because the climatic conditions obliged you, I mean, to seek for new resources continuously, and that's why these tribes were so agitated and also pretty warlike, because it was really a matter of survival. But as we've seen, there were also lots of these tribes moved together with their herds, and which was their main reach. There were, however, merchants as well that were consortiated in caravans, and that also moved along these tracks from oasis to oasis, and basically, as we have seen, linking, connecting through trade the east, like India, and west, as well as Eastern Africa, Mesopotamia, and the Mediterranean as a whole. So as we've seen also, there were several routes, several directions through which these goods traveled. This is very important because it gives you also the dimension a bit of how Arabia was exposed to these influences. I mean, sometimes we underestimate how fast information traveled at the time. These nomads of the deserts, like many other nomads that obviously are mute in our history because they didn't write, so we don't know really what their perspective was, but we don't have to think they didn't know. Hmm. On the contrary, actually, these nomadic peoples were extremely interested in everything that was happening all around, because if there was a new opportunity rising, they wanted to exploit it. So it's like in the steppes of the north of Eurasia. We don't have to think of these populations living there out of the world and not knowing anything, I don't know, about Rome or about China. They knew everything about that. If anything, it was the Romans and the Chinese that kind of ignored them, or they knew they were there, but they didn't take enormous interest in those places because they were poor and not really entering there. And these nomads could really shift pretty quickly. They could move from one side of the continent to the other. So, and really looking at the opportunities that were arising. And merchants in this were instrumental to such information, because obviously these merchants came literally from everywhere, and they could tell the Arabs what was going on all around, and also from different perspectives. This is important, how you shape your mindset. Of course, these were still tribesmen, pretty warlike individuals. They didn't have an enormously developed horizons, but it's still being exposed to so many different influences, and knowing that out there is a world that is extremely wealthy, and they saw that wealth simply because they were essentially looking for it, for raiding it. In looking at so many different perspectives from very different people, from with different ideas, with different religions, with different languages, kind of teaches you to be a bit more malleable. And it is typical of primitive populations, or usually tribal populations, to be extremely more open-minded than paradoxically those more developed civilizations that have many more, say, cultural influences to judge only from their own perspective. So this is being very important during migration here. You see it with the Germans, you see it with other Turkic populations, you see it with the Arabs, that these populations, when eventually they expanded into the civilized, say, world, they were extremely receptive. They didn't close their mind. They seized literally everything, and they were able sometimes to also create, I mean, sometimes, all the times, arguably, to create this enormously important synthesis, just like think about the great Arab thought during the Middle Ages, in science, technology, philosophy, everything that was so original also as a reinterpretation. I wanted to make another point, but I can't remember now. What is that? It was... Well, yeah, whatever. Let's say that in this pre-Islamic past, there was also a huge deal, but we'll see it now, of tolerance and syncretism, as it was typical in the polytheistic world. Tolerance, obviously, not to be intended in the modern sense of the word, but tolerance meaning simply the coexistence of several cults altogether. And this is also important because Arabia, before Islam, had definitely known. Basically, I can't think of a philosophy that hasn't traveled, or a religion that hasn't traveled through there. There were consistent communities of Jews, for instance, into especially in these centers like Yathrib or Mecca, etc., that lived there. Christianism was known. All the other great philosophies of the ancient world were kind of known. So also, and this is very important to understand the same Islam from a strictly from a religious historical point of view, from a philosophical point of view, because there are so many influences coming also from that world. And Islam is a religion of is a Abrahamic religion as well, so it comes sheer from from the same exact origin of Judaism and Christianism. So it's so something very different from what the pre-Islamic, at least polytheistic or animistic beliefs were. But what I mean is as if the Arabs were already exposed to such philosophies at the point of kind of being extremely able to understand them already, and developing something autonomous also in this sense. So unfortunately we're not going to discuss that today, but it's a very very interesting topic. So as we've seen, there were also into Central and Northern Arabia very important centers. Arguably the most important center definitely was Mecca in the area, and this, or Makkah, you wanna call it, that was essentially as every time there is a settlement, you have to kind of figure out why it developed in a certain place. In the case of Mecca, it was uniquely the position that was placed at a crossroad between these itineraries, that these paths, these trade routes, especially the one that stretched here north to south, so essentially from Yemen to Gaza, and that was in fact this main settlement. And what can we say about Mecca as well? Also in here, the origins of these settlements are kind of lost in the mists of history, and some people have said, well, the Ptolemy geography, there is the mention of Makorabat, but there is no proof that it was the Makkah, probably. However, well, okay, this is maybe not so extremely important now. The point I was making is that the Mecca was located in this natural exchange route. So, excuse me, I wanted to check once again. Yeah, okay, sorry, I was looking at one other thing. So going on, these centers were rising as essentially trade centers, as we've seen, and the merchants brought in here an enormous variety of products. And what is interesting is that these centers naturally were developing also a sort of identity on their own. I mean, these centers had been born essentially as tribal centers, initially speaking. That means that there were certain tribes that began to, let's say, initially settle into this place. It was this location was particularly favorable for trade, etc. And around this nuclei of settlement, eventually these cities grew. And naturally, controlling a city like this was a great business, in the sense that whoever controlled the center could control the trade and exact the tolls and so on. So there were extremely bitter and ferocious fights to control these areas, but at the same time it was also a way of sharing this place. There were several communities that were naturally bonded also with these nomadic populations of the desert, who interacted with them a bit, maybe with warfare, a bit with trade. So it was very in every year there was a truce, in fact, that allowed, in the occasion of the market, to to make everybody essentially gathering safely into the Mecca. So this basically allowed the clans also to restock, to make deals and so on, and even enemy clans participated to the market. It was normal, because it was more convenient to do so, even when keeping competing with one another. To every once in a while coming together and dealing, because there is also warfare requires war requires a lot of negotiations as well, and this was an occasion to make it. Naturally, these markets had mostly a seasonal rhythm, every year. I don't know when exactly, but naturally there was a moment in which there were more agricultural goods that were exported at the same time. So also sometimes the merchants traveled preferably in certain periods of the year. So there was a moment in which all these factors together brought to the market to happen yearly. So as we were saying before, the inhabitants of the city and the Bedouins were practically equally organized in tribes. So they were practically the same communities under by certain standards, and according to the circumstances, they could either confederate or to counterpose to one another. The religion of these communities could really vary, in fact, from polytheism to animism. And as we've seen also in these urban centers, there was the consistent presence of Jews. And in fact, especially in Yathrib, the future I don't know how you say that in English, but I think it's the same, Medina. And there were these communities of Jews and also of Christians. So people also coming from a bit everywhere. Actually, Christianism had spread among especially the northern Arabs, and the Jews were this historical presence that always interacted, as we've seen before, with the biblical episode of the Queen of Saba, always also with the Arabian populations. The point I wanted to make is that also in here this religions were already kind of coexisting. The idea was everybody had its own belief, and because all the gods essentially function for different mindsets and backgrounds. The tribesmen were prominently animistic. There is a big deal of this animistic legacy in the Quran itself, just like it exists in the Old Testament, by the way. So there is a kind of I realize I should talk about history of religion in the future, because I think it's crucial sometimes to understand certain points. But it's as if, now to make it simple, to make it approximated, I know that every historian of religion or an anthropologist would dissent quite, but it's as if there was an evolutionary process in the form of the religion. As long as you live in a tribe, into a tribal context, in a nomadic context, you're so also you move a lot. You tend to believe that essentially there are spirits, forces that inhabit the single places or objects, etc. And there are naturally other sovereigns, especially celestial deities, as we've seen also in the Sabaean kingdom that this existed. But essentially, you don't need to structure much more, because that's exactly what your perspective has. You're wandering around, imagine in this Arabian desert, so all you have upon you is the sky. That remains always the same. So you're fixed with that. It's also a way of orientating yourself. Like in the desert, like in the steppes, the sky is particularly important because it gives you also the right direction where to move. If you do not move, you can look at the sky, but in a more centric perspective, not in a let's say in a dynamic perspective, in the sense where you see the sky always being there, however, to guide you. And then all these dots, like we've seen, is few cities, but lots of oases and centers that it's as if they all had a force on their own from this tribesman perspective. It's really the urban populations that began to adopt more eagerly polytheism, because the gods of these communities were actually often the evolution of the same animistic gods in part, but they were starting to be more characterized with the differentiation of the crafts. Also, naturally, there is a dramatic importance of what agriculture brings together with your conception of the world, etc. But it's as if you started to differentiate certain more defined and even more anthropomorphic figures of deities on the base of what you're looking at. I mean, there is a god of agriculture, there is a god of trade, there is a god of, I don't know, for the smiths. This is how, more or less, how polytheism takes shape. And it's very difficult to say, okay, well, this is animism, this is polytheism, because they you can talk about extremes now as I've done today, but it's as if there was a sort of an infinite number of gods, of major deities around which were still these other forces interacting that were maybe an emanation of the same deity, etc. And then from the, let's say, more advanced societies, you found, but also in here it can be debatable, the monotheistic ideal, that is essentially an absolutization of a single of a single deity that is in fact beyond every other entity in terms of power. The idea of an almighty, of an all-powerful, omnipotent figure that is able to essentially impose itself on all the other deities is also a very difficult process to explain, but the important here was still present among these, especially Jewish and Christian communities of Arabia, and so coexisting with these thoughts is, together with other philosophies coming from literally everywhere between East and West, given the Arabian position, was definitely a great mind shaper also for these populations. You can argue, yeah, as I was saying before, that the majority of the Arabs as tribesmen still maintained their own pretty animistic conception of reality, but still there were so many other influences that especially the elites, as always, were trying to observe how, as other viable options. And this is essentially how Islam eventually took root, let's say, because initially it was also a sort of bet from a sort of polytheistic, broadly meant polytheistic mindset. The idea was, okay, let's try this other god, as long as it works and it says, he's the Almighty, etc. And this is how the various Bedouin tribes basically joined into the Islamic invasions, because they were effective. Also think about the same rapacious nature of these tribesmen and the idea of seizing riches, etc. At the end of the struggle between the Byzantine Empire and the Sassanids, this had to be an extremely captivating situation, for which they knew they could, the tribesmen knew could take the spoils of these empires, at least in certain areas, and these had these were tribes that were used only to their relatively small-scale warfare and seizing these caravans, goods, every once in a while, etc. Now it was a matter of seizing entire empires. So just think of how they, even from a religious point of view, they could feel quantitatively the difference in size and proportion of what the Islamic God was meant to be as an almighty, and in fact the prize that would arrive for following it. But at a certain point, Islam was still very young and could basically vanish, even if the Muslims had been defeated at battles like, I don't know, the Yarmouk River, but even some of the battles before this. I'm not saying Islam would have not existed, because probably it would have remained, but it would have been confined, let's say, into these Arabian contexts and not really expanding more than much. But it was exactly the success of the Islamic invasions that fueled the same, given this pre-Islamic mindset that was pretty keen on this idea of, of raiding, of conquering, of seizing. And in fact, Islam has also maintained, different from Christianity, it was influenced by very different Eastern philosophies that were stressing also the physical deprivation sometimes, that eventually Christianity kind of, I can't say went past, but it's kind of, in practice maybe modified a little, but at the core it still existed. The Muslims have this idea that earthly pleasures are kind of a positive thing, that they're kind of a blessing, essentially, that God gives you, as long as they are not intoxicating, as a matter of fact. And that's why, for instance, I don't know, the Sunni do not drink alcohol, or the Shia do not smoke, because there is no actual strict prescription for that, but it's how these communities have interpreted certain part of their holy scriptures by saying essentially you don't have to be obnubilated by in as a general metaphor of life, so not be clouded, not obnubilated, and really concentrating on the efforts that the Islamic religion requires. So even this idea of well-being, of earthly pleasure, is something you find also in certain traditions that have been exported also everywhere. Think about even culinary traditions that you find in certain also regions of Europe that have been dominated by the Arabs, etc. It's a wholly different approach sometimes that has to earthly goods, that comes essentially from the evaluation of those very material wealth that was craved for into pre-Islamic Arabia by these raiders. And because the key to understand is how poor the world was back then, especially think about the 6th century. There is this collapse of the 6th, 7th century. There is this collapse of the late antique world, this definitive contraction with also the plague, etc. And it's the same reason why eventually the Byzantines and the Persians were exhausted and couldn't effectively hold the Islamic invasions, because really it was a dreadfully materially poor world. And probably this is one of the most difficult things to understand for us modern today, because now we are used, at least in our Western world, at least but also now in other developing countries, to the idea of having literally everything, not having to struggle for your own. Yeah, okay, there are people who work a lot of, and etc. But for those times standards, still these people today are extremely wealthy and privileged and rich. Anyway, we reason in relative terms, and in those times, even if you look at the crop rate, the economical, technological potential, it was extremely low. There was no systemic factor that could make you rocket to the stars. So when such opportunities rose, like seizing a, why were these empires in history so keen on conquering each other? Was that they were just bloodthirsty or something? I don't know. It was simply that was the quickest way to obtain more, to have a greater gain. I mean, what you can accomplish today with a, let's say, a effective industrial policy, let's say, is what you could obtain at that time by seizing another country. Essentially, there is no comparison. We can make this comparison, but in fact, just to tell you how different these realities were. So, if you were able, if you were an Arab tribesman in the 7th century that was used just maybe to seize some frankincense from the local caravan, and looking at that as the greatest wealth you could ever imagine, just think of what it could be in comparison, seizing lands, such huge territories like, I don't know, in one shot, in a few years, Egypt, Palestine and Syria. So that's why these populations were so eager to join Islam, because they thought that it had made them want this enormous, even unquantifiable amount of wealth. And that's what made them, say, at that point, bet exclusively on the Islamic God, and eventually bring into this process of to become monotheistic in practice. While still in the first generations, definitely polytheism or animism was very very widespread, and also the allegiance to Islam was sometimes a bit questionable. But ever since they entered into the larger game of controlling this enormous land stretching for all over the Mediterranean and the near Middle East, that was the main point. That was the main focus, and that's how they partially abandoned their old mindset. And as we were saying before, these Arabs were eventually extremely quick at learning from how the rest of the world really was, and probably these pre-Islamic experiences of contact with all these different areas, mentalities, etc., had been important to achieve it. Also, by the way, the Arabs, ethnically speaking, there were very few. So they eventually mixed with the local aristocracies. If you see, after a few generations, you can't even talk about Arabicized elites, but eventually also this ethnic element was pretty much absorbed at every level by the local aristocracies that kept essentially living as such. So, sticking to religion, the major sanctuary of this region of Arabia was definitely the Kaaba, the so-called Kaaba. So this was originally that is still, of course, a shrine, a Muslim shrine now, one of the most important structures of Islam, and they so it was in this fence known as Haram of the Mecca, and it enclosed basically this black stone, the I think it's called Al-Agyar al-Aswad, that is extremely venerated in the Islamic ritual pilgrimage, so that I think every Muslim has to go at the Mecca once when it is her life. So in the in pre-Islamic times, litholatry was extremely spread in Arabia, and in fact the black stone that was enclosed into the Kaaba was object of adoration as a sort of an idol. And by the way, there were also other many other objects like this all over Arabia, and this was nothing but essentially a meteorite. Maybe it's I think it's a block of lava or other other. Sorry, I can't find here the. Oh, let's see if it stops here. Have problems with the computer now, but whatever. So it has this very strong red, dark red color with veining, and it's actually 30 centimeters in diameter. It's not even, but this was also, since prehistoric times, it was the humans understood that these things sometimes came from the sky, literally, and that's why we're naturally so much idolized because they were coming straight from the celestial deity, and it was prodigious. And by the way, the very first certain types of certain materials were used also for weapons, etc., were coming from these meteorites sometimes. So they thought, and these people thought, that there were certain magic powers attached to that, because certain materials at that point, mining was not very developed technologically speaking, so certain metals could be found just through that. And they it was all one with the naturally the physical qualities of these metals and the fact that they came from the skies. It was very important also for the this sacred material, like this basalt. This is what I wanted today. It's a block or other of lava or basalt, and the already in the pagan times, the Kaaba was the destination of annual pilgrimages from every side of Arabia. So these centers also had their fortune in owning such objects. And as we were saying, the Kaaba contained also other idols. So this represented perfectly the polytheistic, let's say, tolerance in the way it was, not in the modern sense once again, but the idea that, I don't know, the more gods existed here, and the more this places, this sanctuaries augmented of power. And according to Muslim tradition, there were up to 360 of these idols within the Aram, so the holy fans. And the principal one was the one of the god Hubal, about which, and we don't really know how much Hubal was connected to the black stone proper from a religious point of view, but it evidently had some connection. So it was Muhammad, when he went eventually to Yathrib, So famously in 623 or 24, depending on how, basically integrated into the Muslim cult the veneration of the Kaaba and the holy pilgrimage that in fact already existed, as we have seen, in the last month of the Arab year. So this process was justified through a Quranic revelation that basically let's say claimed the Kaaba to be the first temple that had ever been erected by Abram and his son Ismail to the true God. So actually the greatest and most important place of veneration of God. So the interesting fact is that now the Muslim prayer was directed. The believer had to pray at this point towards Jerusalem. Now instead, it had to be revolved towards the Kaaba, and famously when eventually when Muhammad entered once again victorious in Mecca, he went back once again to the Kaaba and basically destroyed all the idols that existed around, leaving naturally only the black stone. So stressing at this point the passage from polytheism to monotheism. And naturally we also in here we can debate whether it is historically true, but this is not the point. The point is that the continuity that existed since an early times between the Islamic, let's say the pre-Islamic traditions and Islam. So there are naturally also other legions that were formed later times on on this place. Actually, the definitive building of the Kaaba happened in I don't know exactly when, but let's say at the end of the 7th century, in the beginning of the 8th. I mean, in Umayyad times, under the Caliph Abd al-Malik. So another pagan tradition that survived into the Islamic one is that the external wall of the I think the top of the external wall of the Kaaba has to be covered with a veil of black silk and with embroidered in silver and gold that is to be changed every year. And there was also an economy revolving also around this. As we've seen, these were extremely precious materials, so these were produced somewhere precisely. Since medieval times, these were usually from the 13th century onwards to I think the 20th century. The silk was sent officially from Egypt, and then today I think they're produced in loco actually, and there are many other smaller holy buildings all around that were built more or less whatever. However, the most important point is that this eventually what I didn't say is that the Black Death excuse me, not the Black Death, the Black Stone. I talk so much about the Black Death and medieval on Schwerpunkt in medieval videos that the Black Death was nothing but the same stone that was brought by the Archangel Gabriel, and the this was believed also since ancient times, and that's well where everybody basically from all over Arabia brought their own idols, their own objects of venerations, so that the whole sanctuary was a place of religious syncretism, actually, and tolerance that was typical of pre-Islamic Arabia, and continued arguably for some time as well, because there was no brusque change, abrupt change. Also because, as we've seen, although Arabia, after the Islamic expansion into other parts of the world, was always connected naturally to the to the rest of the Islamic world. Still, the local lifestyle was not radically changed. So even the beliefs of people who had remained in there, etc., remained very strongly, and it was rather eventually the development of Islam in post, let's say, in this post Muhammad times that kind of really canonized the whole thing, started building new conceptions, new theories around it, and managed to impose it into these centers that were now also still much more international than before. But the surrounding populations kind of lived up to the 20th century, basically in the same old ways. So also in there, naturally, there were many changes, but they were much slower. Also, just for saying that you need a structure to make a society. You need to change a structure to make the society change substantially. If there is not a massive structural change, society is gonna slowly evolve, but more or less the differences are gonna be contained. So at the end of the 6th century, there was also another process that was the political instability caused by the continuous wars between the Romans and the Sassanids. So up to the moment in which these empires had been, especially the Roman Empire, been big and stable and so on, the surrounding populations pretty much everywhere had remained pretty much framed into, and obedient. Not really, they weren't really subjects, but this is what happens with the great empires, that they're mostly interested in trade. And they need to pacify. The stronger the one was also more eager to launch into military expeditions. It's because it wants, paradoxically, the peace to be maintained. So there was no reason for populations like the ones in Arabia, but also in the Horn of Africa, to become substantially to rebel, because these empires, first of all, were good trade partners. Secondly, they had a massive military deterrent that nobody wanted really to mess up with. So there was a sort of indirect control that we very much overlook when we think about ancient empires, because in our modern mindset we look at these maps of empires like the Roman Empire and say, oh well, the Roman Empire had these borders and it finished here, and outside of that there was so many disobedient and unruly populations. Telling the truth, the Roman Empire, as any other empire, even the Sassanid one that at this time was very much expanding, had a massive influence everywhere. And as we were saying before, there were populations that the Romans didn't know, but that they still controlled, paradoxically, because their economy revolved, however, around the one of the empire. So talking about borders here doesn't make any freaking sense. Also because ancient empires were by standard, and this could have not changed in any other form, based on the concept of military deterrence. It's the concept of imperium proper. That is, having a military presence that makes everybody kind of calm down, and that's it. So you don't really control certain geographical spaces. You control the people who inhabit at a certain range. And this is how it was conceived. Now, given the terrifying warfare that was going on between the Byzantines and the Persians, and also the shrinking of the empire, especially the Roman one, had basically loosened the grip, especially with the Romans, on the Arab tribes. But nor the Romans nor the Sassanids basically controlled this Arabian territory completely. We have seen how the Sassanids were beginning to expand, eventually at the end of the 6th century in the same Arabia, reaching up to Yemen, and even contrasting the Aksum into Africa. But it was still a pretty fluid systems. And actually these Arabs were kind of having their own specific interests. For instance, there were also other balances that were kind of failed. For instance, the Himyarites that we've seen before had been based as with a traditional friendship with Rome and Constantinople eventually, before falling into the under the domination of the Ethiopians. But there were also other groups that, in this sense, were a whole political balance that was kind of shifting up. And this is interesting because you see when in historical times there are certain blocks that are, and incidentally we're living exactly in one of these moments, that kind of shrink, or at least there is the emergence of other powers, and there is a sort of disorientation. There is this idea of what's the direction we have to take. So everybody not just becomes alerted, but it starts becoming aggressive on its own because there are more opportunities to seize, and this causes pretty much of a chaotic dimension. And now I don't want to make predictions because it would be against my professional ethics of historian now, but I don't think we are in an extremely cool moment to live, because usually there are these long phases of kind of unbalancement, I don't know how to say that are usually followed by dramatic changes that are difficult to predict, definitely, but and there are not these kind of constants in history, but this happened several times, so we can think about it. We can talk about certain populations that were now involved with this let's say international change. The Ghassanids and the Lakhmids, and I think they're the most interesting entities. So the Ghassanids, known as the Banu Ghassans, were this dynasty of Arab princes that dominated the region roughly, so they were pretty much in the north. They were between Damascus and Transjordania, and these were essentially the men of the Romans, and they were actually vassals of the Roman Empire at this point, in the 2 centuries that predated the Islamic invasions. So the also in here there was a it seems that this dynasty kind of emerged in the area as being descending from the refugees that were fleeing the Sabaean kingdom after the first Ethiopian conquest in the 4th century AD. So the Byzantines were essentially entrusting the Ghassanids a certain local title that was the one of Filiarchus, that is sort of chieftains, I don't know how to see this, in their as allies of the Romans, and they were using them as a buffer state, simply how, and especially shielding the eastern flank of the Roman Empire from the side of desert. Because the Romans, by the way, definitely underestimated what the Arabian tribes could do, as it's proven by the events of the 7th century, but this is true up to a certain point, in the sense that they surely knew that there were these kind of warlike nomadic populations that could create problems at the frontiers. So they basically settled the Ghassanid power on that frontier, so they were kind of similar to the Arabs themselves, so they knew how to counter them, but at the same time they were a bit more sedentary, both in origin and given the new places where now they were placed. And also here the Ghassanids were not used by the Romans just to stamp the nomads, but also to balance, let's say, the power of the Lakhmid kingdom that rose on the Al-Hira, on the Euphrates River. So these were Arabs too, as we will say later, but they were instead vassals of the Persians. So it's interesting how the Arabs were used respectively by the Romans and the Sassanids to turn them one against the other. This frontier is often overlooked, and telling the truth, instead, it's very, very, very interesting. And in fact, if you look at the history of the Ghassanids during the 6th century, it's basically all about the wars against the Lakhmids, and this is the only period, by the way, about which we know something consistent about these two populations, because they're better documented. The Ghassanid, also the Ghassanids also here were not really a very central entity. These were still clansmen essentially, but there were major dynasts that were being backed by the Romans in order to maintain a greater control on the whole ethnic group, so that to know how to move it better. This is what the Romans were doing at the same time with the Germans, settling on the Danube with the Longobards, for instance. So it's easier to do, because one thing is to negotiate with every single clan that that not everybody's gonna be fine at this. This also gives time to the overall clans to do whatever they want during the negotiations. And one thing is to have a point of reference represented by a major aristocrat that works as an overlord for the whole group. In fact, the Ghassanid chieftain Al-Arith ibn Jabalah received from Justinian the title of Patricius. So and together with it, this formal sovereignty all over the Arabian tribes that were under the Byzantine control. They were formally allied with the Byzantines. However, the Ghassanids also had contrasting relations with the same Romans, as especially the son of Al-Arith ibn Jabalah, that was known as Al-Mundir III, kind of became a bit more, disobedient towards Byzantines, also for matters of religious problems. In fact, the Ghassanids, similarly to other Semitic populations that lived into the Roman Empire at this point in the Near East, were essentially converting to monophysitism. So the Ghassanids had Christianized as well, and also in here for matters of convenience, just like the Germans were doing in the West, while the ethnic substratum remained essentially pagan. So it's very similar how this was pretty much transversal between West and East. But as, let's say, as the Germans had converted to Arianism for sake of kind of political interests, now the Ghassanids were converted into monophysitism. So this heresy, as a matter of fact, that was spreading, in fact, into the eastern regions of the empire and of Egypt, which, aside from the strictly theological problems that it entailed, was essentially stressing more than else the need of a local autonomy from the central rule of Constantinople, which was a pretty function as a there was a kind of a also fiscal pressure wasn't appreciated. So these heresies were rising not much because of a strictly theological matter, but also rather for a matter of local ambition. So the Christological position of monophysitism was the idea that God had only a single nature, let's say, which was either divine or a synthesis of divine and human. The worst about the whole thing is that monophysitism was being exported by the Alexandrine church also into the Horn of Africa at this point. So it was expanding. This is still about the essentially what the Coptic church in the area still is. So, well, this is not really important, but talking about the Ghassanids, it's still interesting that they chose in that position to maintain also their own space, because these weren't powers that were coming together because they were all fuzzy and friendly together, and so these were essentially entities who were trying to carve their own private dominion into somewhere and not getting wiped out. So there were, say, matching interests with some, but could be also altered for by other reasons. The Ghassanids were fervid monophysicists and therefore posing themselves openly in contrast with the religious politics of the Roman emperors. After a while, Al-Mundir III actually came to be closer with the Byzantines after the first rebellion, and this was very helpful also because the Byzantines required their help against the Persian, and we can see here certain convergences of interest. So as soon as the threat kind of went away, in 581, Al-Mundir III rebelled. He was defeated by the Byzantines, brought as prisoner in Constantinople. His son, basically, An-Numan, went into the had the same made the same end. So actually, this weakened the same Ghassanic power that was destroyed in that favored the Sassanid expedition of 613, and even after that Heraclius reconquered the Syria in 629, the Ghassanids didn't recover their past power that they had enjoyed, and the Ghassanids were on the side of the Byzantines at the Battle of the Yarmouk in 626, that brought to the loss of Syria, eventually to the Muslims, and that's how eventually the Ghassanids were overrun. And we actually know we know substantial information about the Ghassanids from the same Arab sources that naturally are pretty legendary in nature, especially for such an early age. So the Ghassanids represented a bit this
this fascinating Arabian element was passing from, say, nomadism to sedentarism, converting to Christianity, and let's say posing themselves in opposition to the Islamic advance, siding with the Romans, and especially they were very important because through their conversion to Christianism, they brought a lot of also the Syriac and Byzantine, let's say, art and culture through the to the Arabs of the desert. So they were paradoxically instrumental themselves to let knowing the pre-Islamic world more about the Roman world, and paradoxically making the kind of helping eventually the same Muslims to cope with the Romans as enemies. By the way, the Arabs estimated the Muslims estimated the Roman Empire. They rarely made it a. Especially figures like Heraclius were quite praised. Telling the truth, I don't have an excessive sympathy for Heraclius because his history is being told in ways that are maybe a bit too praising. But so passing to the Lakhmids that we quoted today as well, and there is maybe a little less to not really necessarily less to talk about, but this was this other kingdom that we said it extended in southern Iraq and with Al-Hira, in fact in today's Iraq, still as their capital, and they lasted essentially from roughly the beginning of the 4th century to 600 AD. So differently from the Ghassanids, they had a very different background because their origin came from was founded actually they also immigrated from Yemen in the 2nd century, and but they came to dwell essentially on the Persian Gulf side of Arabia. Well, the Ghassanids were kind of more in the west. The Lakhmids dwelled in the east instead, and that's why they fell eventually to under the Sasanian domination. So these were also partly a naval power that operated along the Bahraini coast as well, and reaching also cities of Iran that are just from on the other side of the sea. So this was a very important area for trade, and they at the beginning of the 4th century the Sasanian king Shapur II began a campaign against the Arabs, and initially I think the same Lakhmids kind of asked for assistance to the Roman Empire, but eventually the Persians managed to seize all these regions, especially around the Al-Hira, where the Lakhmid power was forming. So actually Shapur II himself, I think, or however, his army defeated the Lakhmid army and captured the same capital. And there was actually a pretty harsh treatment of the Lakhmids, as the local population was massacred by the Persians. And there was now some also shifting in power at the top, and actually the Romans never made it to intervene into the area, telling the truth. the so the Persians basically put their own Arab chieftain, now puppet, in the at the head of the Islamic kingdom, and gave him also here a title of like king of all the Arabs. So it's funny because it's the same thing the Romans were doing with the Ghassanids. So they were trying to put these two kingdoms, let's say, not just one against the other, but trying to both make them extend the control of their respective empires onto the whole Arab populations. So you can imagine this was also kind of a engagement of other elements coming also from far south in Arabia, and trying to, make them taking sides in part. So these two different axes of direction, the one in the Red Sea, the one on the Persian Gulf, is definitely very, very fascinating. Because, by the way, today we talked mostly about the latitudinal difference, like between the north and the south of Arabia, but there was a consistent difference also between the western and the eastern Arabs at this point. They had very different forms of interaction. By the way, the Eastern Arabs were usually more maritime oriented than the Western ones. They were a bit more of a terrestrial place, which is obvious because Western Arabia is more mountainous. So you have mountains actually almost up to the Red Sea, and while in the east it's more of a kind of a flatland. So there's also more way to access the sea, to deal with it, and there were also naturally different influences. Like on the west you had Egypt and this Aksumite power, and in the east you had the Persian Empire. So very different influences, very different environments also in part. The Lakhmids at this point around the 30s of the 4th century had a sort of eternal struggle, and however the main direction that now the Lakhmid kingdom took was kind of siding with the Sassanians against the Ghassanids and the Romans, incidentally. So they kind of first they had asked help for the Romans, but now they were kind of obliged by even geography, by a certain sense, to stick with against the Romans and their protectorates. By the way, the Lakhmids at this point were actually Nestorians as well. This is another point because the Persians were not naturally Christian, but they were kind of becoming a kind of a more, they were more tolerant towards different cultures. Now this is towards different religions. This is to be explained in many ways. Let's say the Roman Empire was a more centralized power. There weren't, especially from Western Europe, many other religious influences that were all around. There were surely many different polytheistic creeds, but hey, they weren't massively intellectually developing. So at this point in the 4th century, Christianity was expanding far and wide into the empire. The Roman emperors were kind of siding with that. At the end of the century, the Roman Empire also becomes formally Christian, and from that point on, the empire becomes rigidly Christian. So there was kind of no way to, after Nicaea, the documents were sent. Of course, the emperors kind of behaved a bit in a weird way, but generally speaking, there was an orthodoxy that was maintained in Catholicism, and so on. The Persians were, by nature, since the origin, a quite multi-ethnical empire. So they had naturally their own religion. It was this Zoroastrianism. It was actually a pretty much developed thing, but it still, it was mostly an Iranian cult. And even though naturally this cult was felt as a sort of national Iranian, thing, the Persians came to encompass a huge variety of territories that all had their own beliefs and that sometimes were also extremely developed. So it was not like in the West where there were just barbarians. The East was like an extremely effervescent, intellectually effervescent area. So for the Persians, it was easier to accept these cults and for letting their subjects find with that and presenting even an alternative at this point against the Roman domination that was instead becoming more crystallized in its monotheism and kind of excluding the other cults. So what is interesting is that the Lakhmids at this point were converting to Nestorianism, so they were Christians as well. And the Sasanians actually encouraged, seemingly, this developing of the Church of the East into the Lakhmid kingdom, so that it could represent a bold, with respect of the Nicene Creed, an opposing center of Christianity. An heresy actually, because Nestorianism was in fact condemned eventually in the Roman Empire, and therefore hosting in this sense, a kind of rival force to the Roman one, not just as a merely political thing, but as also a religious one. So this is very, very, very interesting. By the way, I suspect the Ghassanids were kind of more important than the Lakhmids, and they were a bit more powerful instead. I meant they were a bit more powerful than the Lakhmids. There were also many, more problems that seemingly the Lakhmids caused to the Sasanians than the Ghassanids caused to the Byzantines, but also in here it was kind of a similar thing, because we've seen how the Ghassanids were kind of monophysites as well. So they also in here, Khosrow II, for instance, put to death another Lakhmid ruler, after which the Lakhmid kingdom was practically annexed to the same Sasanian Empire. So even this experiment was not so entirely successful. And this thing has been the conquest of the Lakhmid kingdom has been kind of criticized by the historiographically speaking, by saying essentially that the Sasanians, the Lakhmids were wiped out in the beginning of 7th century. So if the Lakhmids had remained in there and the Sasanians had not knocked them out, maybe they could have acted a bit as a buffer state against the Islamic invasion. Instead, they kind of wiped it out. They spent resources for destroying it, for occupying the centers, and it basically exhausted also the local resources. So when the Arab invasions began to arrive, there was basically no bulwark anymore. And at the Battle of the Kar, the Arabs managed in 609. The Arabs managed to defeat Sassanid Persia and seize southern Iraq. So this happened in similar ways. It's interesting because also the Byzantines had similar problems a little bit, but at least with the Ghassanids, they in fact we have seen it. They kind of weakened them because of this warfare that took place with the same because of the same religious. Actually, the Sassanids wiped out the Lakhmids seemingly for dynastic problems. At least what the Arabs told us, because kind of the Lakhmid king had refused to recognize to marry his daughter to Khosrow II in marriage. But we've seen also before how there was a general contrast that eventually was weakening progressively the Lakhmid power, and the same happened with the Romans and the Ghassanids, because of the monophysite problem. So that the Byzantines had intervened as well against this Ghassanid power, which had progressively weakened apparently, and therefore also in here not being extremely fit for withstanding the Arab invasion in part, but at that point it was perhaps a bit more of a broader structural weakness, chiefly of the empire. I mean, these buffer states were definitely important, but they weren't really the whole thing, also because their power was backed by the same big empires. So if these big empires were weaker, these weren't much of a stable entity, but surely keeping them a bit stronger could have, it's always a matter of balance, really, because maybe if these states had remained, these Arabian client states had remained a bit stronger, maybe they could have become a threat themselves. After all, it was the same Arabs who eventually invaded the Roman and the Persian Empire. So why these Ghassanids and Lakhmids had to be conceived as something extremely different? Of course, they were more sedentarized, but they essentially came from the same background. So in history, it's always a matter of this balance, and maybe we'll see this in more detail in the future. However, I was glad to talk about this because it's a part of history that is often overlooked. Maybe we'll get a bit more in detail about these powers on another occasion, but for now, let's stop in here. So I hope that, well, I could make a conclusion. What conclusion? No, not really anything. So I want to stop here. So I hope that you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you are interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.